At some point in your life, maybe even now, you might wonder whether freelancing is right for you. You'll need a few things to be successful. First, you'll need a skill that's in demand. This can be as universal as driving a car to as specialized as neurosurgery, and it can be in pretty much any field. The more people who want your skill, and the fewer people who have it, the more you can charge for your services. Next, you'll need to transform yourself into an entrepreneur. Before freelancers can do any work, they have to find it. That takes marketing your services, negotiating contracts, building a network of satisfied clients, and a whole set of administrative skills like project management, time management, and accounting. And thirdly, if you can afford it, it's probably a good idea to budget for some benefits for yourself and maybe your family. Freelancers don't automatically get perks that some salaried jobs offer, like paid vacation or sick leave, life insurance, college tuition, or retirement plans.
And as Great Britain grew, interest in tea spread around the world. By 1700, tea in Europe sold for 10 times the price of coffee, and the plant was still only grown in China. The tea trade was so lucrative that the world's fastest sailboat, the clipper ship, was born out of intense competition between Western trading companies. All were racing to bring their tea back to Europe first to maximize their profits. At first, Britain paid for all this Chinese tea with silver. When that proved too expensive, they suggested trading tea for another substance, opium. This triggered a public health problem within China, as people became addicted to the drug. Then, in 1839, a Chinese official ordered his men to destroy massive British shipments of opium as a statement against Britain's influence over China. This act triggered the First Opium War between the two nations. Fighting raged up and down the Chinese coast until 1842, when the defeated Qing dynasty ceded the port of Hong Kong to the British and resumed trading on unfavorable terms. The war weakened China's global standing for over a century. And as Great Britain grew, interest in tea spread around the world. By 1700, tea in Europe sold for 10 times the price of coffee, and the plant was still only grown in China. The tea trade was so lucrative that the world's fastest sailboat, the clipper ship, was born out of intense competition between Western trading companies. All were racing to bring their tea back to Europe first to maximize their profits. At first, Britain paid for all this Chinese tea with silver. When that proved too expensive, they suggested trading tea for another substance, opium. This triggered a public health problem within China, as people became addicted to the drug. Then, in 1839, a Chinese official ordered his men to destroy massive British shipments of opium as a statement against Britain's influence over China. This act triggered the First Opium War between the two nations. Fighting raged up and down the Chinese coast until 1842, when the defeated Qing dynasty ceded the port of Hong Kong to the British and resumed trading on unfavorable terms. The war weakened China's global standing for over a century.
Cartoonists are like sponges. They soak up people, places, mannerisms, clothing, and behavior. Sometimes they might jot them down in a little black book that they carry around with them. Other times it is just soaked up into the cartoonist's brain, only to be squeezed out later when she is sitting at her drawing table. Not only does a cartoonist have to be aware of what she is seeing visually, but she has to listen to herself think. In other words, take the incoming information and select it, shape it, and then use it for a cartoon. Now that you have an idea or something you think might be good for a cartoon, it's time to shape it. A cartoon is like a staged play. The cartoonist is playwright, director, stage designer, choreographer, and costume designer. The cartoon has characters, a set, dialogue, even if one line, and a backstory. The characters must be dressed to fit the idea, speak in a way that is natural and forwards the idea, or gives the punchline. Nothing should be in the cartoon that is not absolutely necessary for the advancement of the idea. The image and words have to dance together in a way that makes sense. It can be a graceful dance or an awkward dance, if that is part of the humor or idea. And then the execution. Some cartoonists sketch the idea with pencil, then ink it with pen using a light box. Others visualize the image in their head and draw directly on the paper in pen.
This phenomenon of conservation is explained by what we call the first law of thermodynamics, sometimes referred to as the law of energy conservation. The law states, energy cannot be created or destroyed. Energy can be described as the ability to do work, where work is the movement of matter when a force is applied to it. A closed system is a system in which no matter or energy is allowed to enter or leave. The first law of The first law of thermodynamics tells us that the in an ecosystem is constant. It doesn't change. An open system, on the other hand, allows stuff to come in and go out. Since most systems are not closed, the laws of energy conservation can be rephrased to say that the change in the internal energy of the system is equal to the difference between the amount of energy coming in, minus the amount of energy going out. In other words, the amount of energy in the system can change but only if it comes from another system or goes to another system. At any rate, systems, whether they're open or closed, do not create or destroy energy. Rather, energy can enter from one system and leave to another.
First, let's talk about how smell works. From coffee to stinky trash, the substances around us give off volatiles, which you can think of as tiny smell molecules. We breathe in these smell molecules, which then stimulate the olfactory sensory neurons that sit high in the nose. Each of these neurons contains an odor receptor on its surface. Once the odor receptors are triggered by these smell molecules, the neurons send information about them to the brain. Here's what I think is so cool. The brain not only categorizes that information as a particular odor, it may also begin to associate feelings like pleasure or disgust and other moods and emotions with that odor for future reference. For example, you sniff bacon. You eat it, your taste buds get salt, and then your body gets a whack of fat, which is an energy source. So the brain loves it and attaches a positive label to it. The next time you smell bacon, a sensation associated with pleasure arises. First, let's talk about how smell works. From coffee to stinky trash, the substances around us give off volatiles, which you can think of as tiny smell molecules. We breathe in these smell molecules, which then stimulate the olfactory sensory neurons that sit high in the nose. Each of these neurons contains an odor receptor on its surface. Once the odor receptors are triggered by these smell molecules, the neurons send information about them to the brain. Here's what I think is so cool. The brain not only categorizes that information as a particular odor, it may also begin to associate feelings like pleasure or disgust and other moods and emotions with that odor for future reference. For example, you sniff bacon. You eat it, your taste buds get salt, and then your body gets a whack of fat, which is an energy source. So the brain loves it and attaches a positive label to it. The next time you smell bacon, a sensation associated with pleasure arises.
The milk is not typical of all monasteries for many reasons. Firstly, it is very grand, which most especially later foundations aren't. Secondly, it was founded in the countryside, whereas in 17th and 18th centuries, a good proportion of foundations were made in towns. Thirdly, it still owns a substantial amount of land, because fourthly it lies in the Austrian Republic, the only European country where grand old monasteries have been in continuous existence since they were founded 900, 1000, even in one case 1200 years ago.
So we've known for decades that emissions are rising in the atmosphere because we can see them swirling up around there. So the famous Keeling curve is based on what we can actually see from space. But what you can't easily see from space is how did they get there? It still boggles my mind, but even in the year 2021, in most countries and most sectors of the economy, our process for actually answering where all those emissions coming from is still to ask polluters how much they polluted, just kind of like hope nothing is missing in that inventory, and then add up all those numbers, sometimes manually on paper. It's amazing that every single country in the world has agreed to this process. It's one of the great things that brings me hope that everyone in the world is essentially contributing to this process. But it is such a stopgap solution. If we were really serious about stopping climate change, you can only manage what you can measure, and we need to have more information. We need to have information not like letting it take years to compile manual reports. I mean, there are countries that haven't had an emissions inventory in 20 years. What are you actually supposed to do with information that old? We need to not just be looking at what are the emissions of entire countries, because if you want to know how to reduce them, you need to know, right, do I need to go after the cars? Do I need to go after factories? What in my country is driving all these emissions?
You see, camels are one of the only animals in the world that store all their fat in one spot. And that's useful for keeping cool in a hot climate because heat can escape faster from the rest of their body, which helps them maintain a lower body temperature. Compare that to other mammals, like humans, who store fat all over, making it a lot harder to stay cool. Today, camels still use the fat in their humps as a food reserve, but they're not the only ones. In extreme circumstances, the Turkana tribe in Kenya, for example, will eat camel fat to survive.
They suffer a lot from periods of extreme drought. And I have seen these people, they've been very, very short of food, and this is difficult to believe, but it's true, slit open the top of a camel's hump, take out the fat for their own consumption, and then put the top of the hump back on again.
But don't worry, the camel makes a full recovery and instances are rare. But this practice has started to generate some buzz around camel fat as a new superfood. Turns out, camel fat is loaded with fatty acids, vitamins, and minerals.
I bet all of you are familiar with this view of the ocean. But the thing is, most of the ocean looks nothing like this. Below the sunlit surface waters, there's an otherworldly realm known as the twilight zone. At 200 to 1,000 meters below the surface, sunlight is barely a glimmer. Tiny particles swirl down through the darkness, while flashes of bioluminescence give us a clue that these waters teem with life. Microbes, plankton, fish, everything that lives here has amazing adaptations for the challenges of such an extreme environment. These animals help support top predators such as whales, tuna, swordfish, and sharks. There could be 10 times more fish biomass here than previously thought. In fact, maybe more than all the rest of the ocean combined. There are countless undiscovered species in deep waters, and life in the twilight zone is intertwined with Earth's climate. Yet the twilight zone is virtually unexplored. There are so many things we still don't know about it.
There is a lot of water on Mars and there once was a lot of surface flowing water. You don't see it because most of it is mixed with the soil which we call regolith on Mars, so the Martian soil can be anywhere from as little as 1% in some very dry desert, like areas to as much as 60% water. So, one strategy for getting water when you're on Mars is to break up the regolith, which would take something like a jackhammer because it's very cold, it's very frozen. If you can imagine making a frozen brick or a chunk of ice that's mostly soil and maybe half water and half soil, that's what you would be dealing with. So, you need to break this up. Put it in an oven. As it heats up it turns to steam. You run it through a distillation tube and you have pure drinking water that comes out the other end. There is a much easier way to get water on Mars. In this country we have developed industrial dehumidifiers, and they're very simple machines that simply blow the air in a room or a building across a mineral called zeolite. Zeolite is very common on Earth, it's very common on Mars. And zeolite is kind of like a sponge. It absorbs water like crazy. Takes the humidity right out of the air. Then you squeeze it and out comes the water.
In today's lecture, I'm going to talk about changes in air pollution since the middle of the last century and what has created these changes. So, by the 1950s, air pollution was very visible with frequent thick black fogs known as smogs in many large cities around the world. The main source of this pollution was from factories and it caused severe health problems. For example, a particularly severe smog in London in 1952 caused over 4,000 deaths. Obviously, something had to be done, and in 1956 a Clean Air Act was introduced in Britain. This addressed the pollution from factories and the smog soon disappeared. However, as you know, these days air pollution is still a big issue. The main difference between now and the 1950s is that you can't see it, it's invisible. Also, the main source of pollution now is from cars and lorries, and although these don't produce visible signs, this air pollution is still a significant risk to health. And one of the key factors in the rise of this type of pollution is that we have all become much more vehicle dependent. There are far more cars and lorries, trains and planes than in the 1950s, and this is now the main source of air pollution around the world.